Welcome to the 2023 lecture series of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. I'd like to take this opportunity to extend a hearty welcome to all persons present on behalf of the museum and the management of the museum. My name is Mark Cummins. I'm your chairperson for this afternoon session. You're not going to be hearing very much from me. You'll be hearing from the featured guests, Mr. Kevin Farmer. But I'll just say a few words. I certainly would like to thank everyone for taking time out of your very busy schedules to join us for this very exciting presentation. And we certainly appreciate the support that you have given to the museum, especially as part of this lecture series. I have had excellent experiences with the museum, especially when I previously sat in the chair as Chief Town Planner. Museum provided us with very, very rich professional comments on both history and archaeology. And I will always remember the work done at Port St. Charles. Not that there wasn't good work done at other places, but I would always remember the work that we did at Port St. Charles. And I'm sure that rich relationship still continues now with the planning and development department. That's a few housekeeping matters. What I would like you to do is, if you have any questions, you can post them. You can post them in the chat, and also we will have the question and answer in Zoom. But if you post them in the chat, that will speed up the process. So I'm going to read a short bio of our presenter, Kevin Farmer. Mr. Farmer has MA, and he's currently the Deputy Director of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. He said he holds a master's degree in heritage studies from the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill. And from 2010 to 2011, he was assistant lecturer in archaeology in the Department of History at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, Trinidad. And he has also been a part-time lecturer in the Master's Heritage Studies program at the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill. Mr. Farmer is co-editor of Plantation to Nation, Caribbean Museums and National Identity, and was the principal researcher on the Barbados Museum's nomination to the Memory of the World Register, where he examined the location and condition of extant documents relating to slavery and the slave trade in the Caribbean. This research resulted in the successful inscription of the enslaved archives housed at the Barbados Museum onto the Memory of the World Register. He also worked on the research team to compile the nomination dossier for Historic Bridgetown and its garrison, and serves as an active member of the Barbados World Heritage Committee. He has also written about the contemporary state of cultural resource management in Barbados, in Protecting Heritage in the Caribbean, edited by Peter Siegel and Elizabeth Reiter. His research interests include the creation of cultural identity in post-colonial states, the role of museums in national development, and the management and curation of archaeological resources. This afternoon, Mr. Farmer will be presenting to us Guardians of Our Heritage, the Museum and the Center for Cultural Resource Management. Now, this presentation examines the work which goes on in securing our built heritage at the museum, inclusive of work with the unearthing and management of our archaeology resources, and with regard to managing the built heritage within the context of the country's development of its urban and rural planning and cultural resource management. Mr. Farmer will also look at the many international partnerships which have seen the fruition of worldwide recognition of Barbados's unique heritage. This will consider especially the museum's involvement with various forms of World Heritage inscription and designation, but especially with regard to the successful inclusions on the World Heritage List. Ladies and gentlemen, I present Mr. Kevin Farmer. Over to you, Kevin.
Thank you, Mark. Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. Wish to express my gratitude and thanks not only to the chair, but to the Publications Committee for inviting me to speak to you this afternoon. Very soon I will share my PowerPoint presentation with you, so you'll not see my face, but hear my disembodied voice. And then I will rejoin you on camera at the end. I'm looking forward to the Q&A session as we examine how the museum has in fact helped to shape cultural resource management in Barbados over the last 90 years. At this point, I will move to share my screen. Right, so I'm hoping that everyone can see that. Can you? Yes? Okay, good. Cultural resource management as a means by which to safeguard the material culture of the past, understanding its landscapes and our built heritage, as well as the archaeological resources of the island, has been foundational to the creation right. All right, I'm hoping that everyone can still hear me.
Yes.
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, great. Has been foundational to the creation of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society since 1933. On your screen, you're simply seeing those founding members under the sandbox tree in the main courtyard of the museum, as well as the two shots. The upper shot is the museum as it would have been in 1933, just prior to occupation by the Historical Society, and then later on in the 1950s. It's important to note that at the outset, the museum's creation in 1933 set out its intentions at its first general meeting to examine three major themes as it related to the built heritage of the island. The council and its members at that time recommended that the society should be involved in the systematic researches regarding the Aboriginal Indian occupation of Barbados. Secondly, that they should reconsider the 1910 report of the Historic Sites Commission and the efforts being made to carry out the recommendations of that committee in 1910. And thirdly, to inquire into the old windmills still standing on the island at that time. And when you go through the proceedings of the AGMs of the society, which were, well, which were held almost quarterly, they kept referencing their ongoing work under these three standing committees. And in fact, in 1933, after having reviewed the 1910 Historic Committee's report, the society actually wrote the government of the day asking that government assist them to repair and reletter what was a tercentenary memorial at Land's End, which is in fact that memorial that we see as we drive past the Spring Garden Highway every day on a playing field next to the courts building. That petition for me underscores the positive interaction that the society has had with government since the 1930s in ensuring the upkeep, maintenance, and preservation of built heritage. And at the same time, at its first ever exhibition at Queen's Park, during the annual exhibition in 1933, the Society actually showcased what were referred to as Arawak remains of Barbadian origin, brought together by the patient industry of Dr. Hudson and his brother, the Archbishop of the West Indies. Subsequently, the museum also acquired some rather important archaeological collections, those collected by Edward K. Knight, writings in the museum's journal by C.N.C. Roach, who was a major antiquarian and collector of the day. And they continued to have discussions and make inquiries into both that Aboriginal past, as they termed it at that time, as well as the built heritage. In fact, when one continues to review those early museum proceedings and later AGM reports, it provides snippets of the contribution of the Society to the developing landscape of heritage management, archaeological research, built heritage, and environmental matters. In fact, members of the Society participated in the first regional conference of archaeology held in Martinique in 1961, being represented by Mr. R.V. Taylor and Mr. Neville Connell, who was the museum's director from 1948 to 1973. And they were in fact building on the works, collections, and the intermittent writings of E.M. Shilston, J.L.K. Petter, E.G. Sinclair, C.N.C. Roach, Edmund Knight Taylor, and G.T. Barton. And in fact, both Mr. Taylor and Mr. Connell's participation in that archaeological symposium in Martinique led in 1967 to Dr. Ripley and his wife Adelaide Bullen coming to Barbados in 1967 and conducting what would have been at the time the first modern scientific archaeological research into the prehistory of the island at that time. Their initial research pushed back at the time what was seen as the origin date of Amerindian peoples on island to roughly 500 years. However, it was not until the late 1980s with what was at the time a seminal project between the Barbados Museum and Historical Society and the Institute of Archaeology of the University College London in 1984. That 25-year project has revolutionized the archaeological landscape in Barbados, especially as it pertains to its prehistory. Led by both the late Dr. Peter Druitt and his late wife Liz Druitt, who was an archaeological illustrator, it transformed how prehistoric Barbados had at that time been perceived. It examined migration, foodways, arrival times, sites lived at, worked from, places and types of leisure. Dr. Druitt rethought the sphere of influence that was Barbados, noting it as one of the oldest occupied pre-Columbian sites in the Lesser Antilles, dating back to roughly 630 before present. His work has been taken up by Scott Fitzpatrick, who in fact did his postgrad work in Barbados and has also revised those dates, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But I want to underscore the work by Dr. Druitt and the museum at the time. And in fact, I will argue that the majority of the prehistorians now working in the region, as well as some historic archaeologists, are in fact products of the almost 25 years of field schools conducted by Dr. Druitt in Barbados. They include Dr. Fitzpatrick and Dr. Mikey DeWall, who's looked at the site limits of both Tree Houses and Maycott's Bay in St. Lucie. And in fact, one could easily argue that Dr. Druitt's work has driven the last 40 years of research in the subregion. And of course, this mantle has recently been taken up by Corrine Hoffman and her students over the last decade from the University of Leiden. Now, when we talk about cultural resource management, we're speaking about the management and preservation of cultural resources, landscapes, archaeological sites, historical records, historic buildings, and industrial heritage and artifacts. And for the purpose of this discussion, I wish to go international and regional and then bring it back home to Barbados. So please indulge me as we look at the international context, then the regional, Barbados, how it is then tied to World Heritage, locally what we found over the last 90 years, and then the new ways forward for cultural resource management in Barbados. In the US, CRM is normally legally mandated in terms of the protection of archaeological sites situated on public lands that are threatened with destruction through development of any sort. Whereby in the USA and UK, there are extensive laws that have been enacted to protect sites on federal lands as well as state, and in the case of the UK, regional and districts. Such has not been the case in this region and in Barbados in particular. Cultural resource management is the vocation and practice of managing our cultural heritage. We sometimes only manage it when it is under threat, and we seem almost to be reactive in what we do and not proactive. But what I wish to state is from the early beginnings of the society, whether they're antiquarians, and then we moved into modern archaeology, the last 90 years, and especially the last 40 years, has been both seminal and transformative in understanding where Barbados is situated within the widest sphere of understanding of that pre-Columbian past. And please indulge me. Archaeological evidence points to the early settlement of the island by archaic peoples, perhaps as early as 3000 BC, according to Druitt. This evidence was recovered from the Haywood's Fort St. Charles site, which Mark noted in his introduction. That is perhaps one of the more important rescue archaeology excavations done on island up to present, and in fact allowed us to push back the occupation date of Barbados by almost 1500 years. The site, which is located near Marine Inlet, was excavated initially in 1991 by Druitt, at the time revealing 2 conch lit shell tools and several conch shells. These were dated and provided a date of 3980 plus or minus 100 years. Now, Fitzpatrick has subsequently followed up on the research done by Druitt and has pushed that date back even earlier, roughly to 4,230 before present, and in one other case, 4,360 years before present. At the time, the site was probably a temporary foraging and fishing camp for archaic people living on the island. Given the rise in sea level over the intervening period, many of these archaic coastal sites on Barbados may either actually be in the sea or totally washed away. These sites, in fact, these Barbadian sites, in fact, correspond to contemporary Otteride sites in Trinidad. And Trinidad, in fact, has the oldest dated site in the Southern Caribbean at about 5000 BC. These peoples, these archaic peoples, were primarily subsistence hunters and gatherers who exploited both terrestrial and marine ecosystems. This, of course, is reflected in the stone tools, and in the case of Barbados, shell tools used for the processing of vegetable matter. The second wave of migrants who come to this island, we speak to them in terms of their pottery style. Saladoid peoples coming out of the Orinoco region of the Guianas, roughly around 80, well, BC 400 to 80, 450. In Barbados, elements of this style evolves and we get terms such as Barancoid. And in fact, some of the earliest dates for this go to an inland site at what was then called Goddard's or the Star de Stump site, which is now the location of TMR as their headquarters. And that work was done by Stephen Hackenberger, who was a volunteer of the US Peace Corps here in Barbados in the 1980s. Likewise, we have sites on the eastern coast of the island. The newly revamped community center at Bashiba, which incidentally utilizes the old place name of Hillcrest, is one such site, and is in fact the oldest Saladoid site on the entire east coast of Barbados. And that dates from 380 to 460. And lastly, on the island, as we come closer to the point of contact with Europeans, there is that tradition of the Trumasoid or Trumassan tradition, for which we find a number of sites along the south and southwestern coast of the island. Incidentally, the site at Indian River is a combination of early Saladoid and then later Trumasoid. And this is the Indian River that is there along the Spring Garden.
Sorry, Kevin, but we're not seeing images. They're not shifting.
We're getting there. That was just an introduction. We're going to get to some images. And more importantly, in this image, Peter Druitt, there in his trademark laugh and sunglasses, and Liz not too far behind. So I want to pay tribute to them. Liz sadly passed away earlier this year. Peter a couple of years ago. Now, part of the educational focus of archaeology on the island, and this is the Haywood site in the late 90s, and Coshington College in the late 90s as well, that you're seeing on your screen. The education of the public, whether through public lectures or utilizing and teaching young people through our junior curator program, has been a way in which we sought to educate the public in relation to what types of environments and the type of peoples who would have lived on this island. The other important fact of the Haywood site, even though you see an abundance of water, is in fact the creation and utilization of large ceramic vessels in which to create pot stacks in order to obtain fresh water. And what is equally important is that where you find fresh water, either in the form of springs or above ground streams in Barbados, you are very much going to find a nearby Amerindian site. This is simply because the island's geological formation does not allow for a lot of above ground water, but provides many instances of the ability for persons to obtain fresh water from streams which come above ground. What else have we found out as we have excavated these sites over the years? The understanding that Barbadians, present-day Barbadians, consume some of the same food that their prehistoric ancestors would have eaten. Foods such as sharks, grouper, flying fish, herring, jacks, grunts, parrotfish, barracuda, and of course, sea egg. Turtles were eaten quite a lot by the Amerindian peoples, as well as lobster and crab. And it is quite interesting how we, in turn, utilize some of those same marine species today. Of course, there's some of them that we can no longer eat because we have almost eaten them out of existence. Another photo of Peter and Liz Jewett looking at the excavation at Chancery Lane, which again is one of those sites that we keep returning to. Shilston in the 1930s had begun excavations at Chancery Lane, in his words, looking into that Aboriginal past. And here we are, almost 60 years after Shilston, going back to the same place to try to get a better understanding of how these pre-Columbian people would have settled and lived on this island. The Barbados Archaeological Survey, which began in 1984, lasted for about 25 years. The three publications which came out of that field were Prehistoric Barbados, Prehistoric Settlements in the Caribbean, and Above Sweet Waters. One of the few occasions where an entire island has been archaeologically excavated, explored, and understood. From north in Maycox to Oistins, to Hillcrest on the east coast, Spring Garden on the west, we've excavated over 70 prehistoric or pre-Columbian sites on this island. That has allowed us to have a better understanding of the peoples who settled here, the fact that settlement, which it was thought only happened sometime in the period Anno Domini, actually goes back to the period before Christ. And at the same time, has allowed one to understand not only were settlements along the coast, but that some were also inland in places like Greenland, in St. Andrew. But of course, the Archaeological Survey in a way also has helped in a way skew the archaeology on island. The majority of archaeological sites in Barbados have been predominantly prehistoric. There have been very few historic excavations done on island. And we will speak to one of them during the course of this presentation when we speak about Haywoods. But the larger understanding is that historical archaeology on the island has been directed mostly at rural landscapes, burial sites, and enslaved villages and sugar estates, with some work done in the urban environment and within the creolization of pottery manufacture, as well as an understanding of the utilization of grabland, whether at low level or in the Barbadian context, up in the hills as it relates to below cliff work done by Matthew Riley in the 2000s. But predominantly, it has been preoccupied, and rightly so, with an examination of the lifeways of the enslaved, especially during and in that space of the plantation. Much of this, in a way, following what has been Caribbean history and its look into that enslaved past. But where does that intersect with cultural resource management? Sites are infinite resources. Once they have been destroyed, whatever evidence and whatever we can learn from them is destroyed. And because we live and work within a space that has been continually impacted by development over the last 300 years, whether it be agriculture, industrialization, or urbanization, it is necessary and important for us, when possible, to be able to investigate these sites in order to have a better understanding of who we are and to have a better sense of how our ancestors would have lived, obstacles that they may have faced, and how they would have dealt with this. And this is only to be seen within the material culture, because it's simply not recorded within the documentary evidence. It also means that there is a need for legislation within the continued development of cultural resource management in Barbados. What has happened over the last 40 years, and these are images taken from the enslaved burial ground at Newton, which was initially excavated in the late 1970s by Fred Lang and Jerome Handler, that with the rapid development of urban space and even rural spaces, resources needed to locate enslaved burial grounds take on an even greater significance as we seek to piece together and understand the historic past. Burial sites can be used to reconstruct cosmology, diet, morbidity, and material culture consumption as utilized during the ritual of death. Such practices might even inform a new cultural shift brought about through deculturalization, leading to the creation of other cultures on this island. Research into enslaved persons living in urban Barbados have been undertaken by Smith and Farmer. The excavation of burial spaces within urban Bridgetown has provided invaluable insight into the lifeways of enslaved persons living in the port city. And we have only to look at Pierhead and Fontebelle. But when we go to understand and to better manage these resources, one of the prime examples for me is in fact the enslaved burial ground at Newton, which was bequeathed to the museum by the owners in the 1990s. There's ongoing work to acquire a bit more of the burial ground as we begin to understand the extent of the burial ground within the Barbadian setting. And as well as we begin to decolonialize and destigmatize some of our understandings around enslaved burials, as we begin to deconstruct and decolonize words like obia, and recognition that words do in fact matter. So you will see in the last 3 or 4 years, the museum speaking to the enslaved burial ground at Newton, as opposed to the Newton burial ground. It is about privileging the persons who are interred there and not privileging the plantation itself. The management of archaeological resources requires a diverse range of skills necessary to enable efficient and effective site management that balances both the conservation and development requirements of the site within a legislative framework, and in some cases where such legislation does not exist. In Barbados, legislative control is exercised by the central government through its various agencies, some of which receive advice from NGOs like the Barbados Museum as part of a statutory requirement. In some cases, advice is received outside of that statutory requirement, which specify to the ministry which industry it should contact for information or consultation. Decisions on archaeological and historic environments must be based on the informed opinion of experts. Whether or not the decision reached in respect of the resources based on informed opinions is always debated amongst heritage professionals. The final arbiter for site use, not only in Barbados, but in most of the English-speaking Caribbean, resides with the minister, or ultimately the ministry responsible for such legislation. Of course, decisions can be informed by developmental considerations and not always the need to safeguard the integrity of archaeological resources. But where that is not possible, then the case study of Fort St. Charles becomes important. Development constraints meant that that site would have been destroyed. Through consultations with the museum and at the time, the town planning department and the owners, they understood the archaeological importance of the site and allowed for excavation over a 4-year period whilst they were continuing their phased development. And that for me is one of the better examples of what happens when developers, the researchers, and government come up with a solution in order to understand the importance of a site. We have seen additional such excavations or watching briefs be undertaken at Church Village through the BTI and the Central Bank of Barbados. Watching briefs, incidentally, at Exmouth, what used to be the buildings that would have held automotive art. Watching brief was carried out there. This is all within the last 10 years. The most recent was a watching brief carried out at the Hotel Indigo, being built along the Hastings Boardwalk. We look forward to such watching briefs being carried out in the construction of the Hyatt and those hotels to be built along the beachfront leading into the city. At the same time, there is in fact need for us to have effective enabled legislation in order that we can strike that balance between the preservation of the past and development. Whether or not one should implement rescue archaeology and how, in fact, within environmental impact assessments and archaeological impact assessments, one should seek to safeguard sites in relation to how they're being developed. And in this, we come to the law. Local legislation is tied to international conventions. Cultural resource management is in turn tied to local legislation, whether it be heritage or antiquity laws, land use laws, building requirements, marine and maritimes law, as well as what is in the parlance called small finds, i.e., what are the laws that govern the artifacts which are excavated? And I want to note that in Barbados, we have still pending Preservation of Antiquities Rex Bill. We have a new Planning Development Act. We have the Coastal Zone Management Act and the National Conservation Commission Act. We still await Antiquities Bill, but we recently passed a Cultural Industries Bill. These then become linked and joined to Barbados as a state party, adhering to international conventions like UNESCO. This is where they in fact intersect. And in the case of Barbados, they intersect around the World Heritage Convention, where our local legislation shows how we are managing our cultural resources so that when we make the case that a particular site and or sites should in fact be inscribed on the World Heritage List, it is not only backed up by the historical work, but is in fact undergirded or underpinned to how we effectively manage the sites for which we are in fact guardians of as persons who live here on the island. And as you know, our first World Heritage Site is Bridgetown and its historic garrison, which was inscribed on the World Heritage List in 2011. And these are the conventions to which Barbados, as a state party, has now signed up to. The protection of world cultural and natural heritage, Convention on the Protection and Promotion of Diversity of Cultural Expressions, ICH, of which you've been seeing quite a lot of in the news of late. And we've recently enacted maritime legislation, which allows us now to be signatories for the Convention on the Protection of Underwater Cultural Heritage. And that has only happened in the last 2 years. But because of such legislation, because of the work of both government agencies and the NGO community, do we have the inscription of our capital city. And this is perhaps the one of the better examples that we can point to as to what happens when multiple sectors and multiple agencies work together in carrying out cultural resource management in its widest possible remit and ambit. It leads to such inscriptions. And such inscriptions result in management plans that are multi-agency, multi-sectoral, and in some cases, multi-generational. And in fact, calls for great community participation to ensure that civil society and property owners actually maintain a site. And this is that site, historic Bridgetown and its garrison. I like to state that the museum's contribution to CRM over the last 19 years has been in multiple forms, advice both to government and other NGO communities. The creation of that Built Heritage Committee going back to 1933, in fact, evolved 30 years later in the 1960s into the creation of the Barbados National Trust. The museum's continued review since the late 70s and 80s of the physical development plan of Barbados to ensure that both the built heritage and archaeological resources remain almost front of mind within the planning process has been ongoing. The advice that we've given to the government of Barbados as it relates to conventions and how they impact us on the local level and how we in turn can impact them at the regional and international level. Given our expert advice as it relates to the creation of national legislation, the most recent being our review of maritime legislation that has led to the enactment of new maritime laws, periodic reports, both to government and regional and international bodies as it relates to the management of archaeological and built heritage environments in Barbados. The development of disaster plans, which always seems sometimes to be seen as a forethought, is in fact part of cultural resource management. And in this, the museum has been both a thought leader and exemplar over the last 90 years. In fact, I must call attention to a meeting that was convened at the Hilton Hotel, I think around 2020, where for the first time on a regional level, there was a recognition that the disaster management sector had not factored in enough thought about how best to provide cover for heritage institutions during and after natural and man-made disasters. And that particular workshop becomes almost a touchstone in terms of implementation over the next decade. Museum was fortunate enough, being one of the members and founding members of the Museums Association of the Caribbean, to be invited to that workshop to discuss with regional disaster management planners how best to integrate and begin to implement policies that would provide for some safeguard for heritage going forward. And of course, in this, we continue to contribute to work and publications relating both to CRM and archaeology in the region. And these perhaps are some of the most recent. Protecting Heritage in the Caribbean, which feels like around 2000. Caribbean Heritage in about 2011, 12. And then in 2019, 2020, pre-colonial and post-contact archaeology in Barbados, which, if you do have an interest, is a most interesting and fascinating read, especially as we begin to look at community involvement in safeguarding heritage sites on this island. This is a map showing some of those 70 plus prehistoric sites on island. Very quickly, CRM in Barbados is dependent on knowing where these heritage resources exist, both above and below the ground, coupled with a clear understanding of how to strike a balance between conservation, controlled public access, and visitor management in relation to heritage districts. This all falls under CRM, but must be underpinned with an understanding and embedded within legislation and policy. As such, we must move to combat the lack of funding, which oftentimes results in a reactive rather than a proactive management of Barbados's archaeological resources. Proactive CRM includes forward planning, systematic inventorying of archaeological materials, and ongoing monitoring of archaeological sites and monuments. And for me, I dare say the addendum is with the participation of the community. Without community participation, CRM, as we wish it to unfold, will simply not be possible. We have too few resources amongst professionals in order to carry this out properly. We must, in fact, look at engaging the community to partner with us to ensure that CRM becomes not only a proactive tool, but an effective way by which the entire society is involved in the preservation of its own history. The things that we must always pay attention to are the conflicts of interest that might arise within CRM, because it's normally the developer who is paying for such work, and there must be policies put in place that the outcomes of some research, which they might seem as detrimental to their development, can't be avoided, because it is within the public good that such spaces be preserved, and to find the mechanisms and mitigate around the balance between development and preservation. The way forward. I have about, what, 5 minutes? Okay. There's at present the need for an enforcement of policy guidelines as outlined in the new Planning and Development Act. At the same time, the need to grow capacity. Enforcement is extremely important during all phases of development. The lack of enforceability makes any provision of acts or policies redundant. There's therefore a need to assist agencies and landowners in protecting that scarce resource, which is our archaeological heritage. They could be the provision of grants, tax incentives to ensure that the resource is protected and maintained by the landowner. Conversely, a series of punitive damages in the form of monetary penalty or jail time must be enacted to ensure compliance with the law. The ability to redeem stolen property, which belong to the people of Barbados, is also important. The passage of legislation to protect archaeology, both marine and terrestrial, is urgently needed. The greater cooperation amongst agencies in almost a multi-sectoral way is necessary so that land management and archaeology and water management have that interface so as to ensure preservation and conservation of this rather scarce resource. We are in fact at a crossroads where there is that need to ensure that cultural resource management is enacted to benefit the education not only of present but future generations. There's a need for training in archaeology and conservation. There's a need for training in the enabling legislation and drafting as such. But all attempts to protect hinge on robust legislation that both rewards and punishes in the name of protection. Else, our archaeological heritage will cease to exist in the not too distant future. And within this, we must understand that our intangible heritage also plays a part within the archaeological heritage as well. And I want to underscore that by simply going back to this image. This is an artistic impression of the memorial to be built at the enslaved burial ground at Newton. A lot of this would not have been possible without archaeology and without that nascent development of CRM in the 70s, 80s, and 90s in Barbados, which recognized the importance of the site and sought to safeguard it within an environment where there was no enabling legislation, but using moral suasion, and continues to advocate for stronger, more robust laws, especially as more people begin to have an understanding, not only of, but of where the site is and what it means, not only to Barbadians, but people in the diaspora. This legislation must protect the historic landscape, as we no longer concern ourselves with individual artifacts or sites, but be willing to embrace the complexity of our cultural landscapes in which sites and artifacts may be placed, so that we begin to see them in a holistic way and begin to interpret their meaning for our peoples in a holistic way. The systematic recording of the archaeological landscape must be a priority in both the cultural resource management and archaeological heritage management of Barbados. Thank you. Great. My mouse is playing the phone. Right, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kevin. for that very insightful, thought-provoking, and fact-filled lecture. And now I don't see any questions in the chat, so I open the floor for any questions that our audience may have for Mr. Farmer. There's one, Kevin.
There's one, where's that?
The question is, what might be the best solution to advancing with antiquities legislation? What might be the best solution to advancing with antiquities legislation?
Wow. My short answer to me that the best solution is for us to in fact pass it. There's model legislation that has been outlined over the last couple of years. There's also existing legislation that we can look at from Jamaica and the Bahamas, and Belize to a certain extent, that we perhaps could follow, have the particular town hall meetings as is necessary when one is looking at such legislation, but understand that as we continue to delay, sites that we might not even know about are being destroyed, simply because persons can go about and destroy them at will. And that I find quite problematic and horrific to think about. So it's really for us to become a bit more proactive, take a look at these existing legislations and the model legislation, civil society and government coming together and to get this done, and to get this done as a matter of urgency, especially when we look at it within the wider framework of the greater occurrence of natural and man-made disasters around the region. Recognize that unless you have that, your post-disaster recovery, and especially your post-disaster recovery of your cultural heritage, is going to become quite problematic when anyone can simply go anywhere. So said, oh, I found this and it's finders keepers. You have no legislation that says, well, in fact, that belongs to the state and you must return it. So for me, it's let's get together and get this done, I guess is the best solution. And hopefully that answers the question from the person. But thank you for the question. It's a quite thought-provoking one and one that is necessary.
Thanks, Kevin. The next question is from Dr. Welch. Dr. Welch, proceed, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Hi, Professor Welch.
Hello. Thank you very much, Kevin, for that very important presentation. Certainly, you're dealing with a very complex matter, associated matters. Nevertheless, there are just a couple of questions I wish to pose to you, but not so much that I don't know in my own mind what maybe somebody asks, but because I feel perhaps it may be useful to explore these things. One is, when you refer to the community, what exactly is this animal we call the community? What exactly is it? That's one. And secondly, tied to that is the fact that you use the term enforcement. I know I heard you as you used it earlier. I think I understood precisely what you meant, but at the same time, I was having a little difficulty in trying to balance a view of what the involvement of the community with the whole question of a notion of enforcement. And that is tied also to the question, the point you raised about people might be declared finders keepers, but the thing belongs to the state. And then yes. I found that very interesting, that if you're speaking about the community involvement and the community playing a vital role, and then at the same time you're speaking about the state, and at the same time you're also speaking about a question of enforcement. Perhaps you can speak broadly to those various issues which I think have surfaced in your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Okay, let's deal with the larger concept of the community. For me, the larger concept of community is us as Barbadians. Whether those stakeholders are an NGO community or a government department, or the people living in a district and a village. Because what you find in terms of when you talk about enforcement on the development side, it is about what is the law and legislation. How can the people be involved in what for me is a wider democratic process around, for example, how development applications are processed. At present, a development process says that a developer should have a town hall meeting or a social impact assessment within a particular community. I'm saying I would like to see that go maybe 2 or 3 steps further in those areas that have been designated to have a historic district, or in which the residents believe that the building or site is culturally important to them. There should be a mechanism by which they can approach the planning department or the Ministry of Culture, whomever, to say, this is a site for us that we think are culturally important. We've documented it, and we believe that it needs to be placed on a particular list to safeguard it. Now, part of the safeguarding of that site, even though it has a legislative underpinning, part of the enforcement of that protection also resides with the community, because the community live there or they live nearby. They're going to be the first people who are going to see if anything untoward is happening. They're going to be the first people who might report on the viability of the site after a natural disaster. How do we get their voice to be part of the mechanism that goes around its protection? So maybe I should not use enforceability. Maybe I should find a nicer word and say how they can help us to protect the site. And so that feeds into that particular foundational layer. But all of this is about the widening of the democratic process for the inclusion of sites that the community believes are important. So sites might be important at a district level, at a parish level, at a national level, and then beyond the national level at a regional or international level. And until we begin to embed those types of layers and educate Barbadians to what is possible, but at the same time provide the mechanism and system for that type of feedback and protection, then a lot of what we're talking about, both tangible and intangible, I think is going to disappear, because you're going to have people in the community saying, well, yeah, I remember that site. We saw it begin to erode, but we didn't know who to call because they felt powerless. So for me, part of the empowerment is the involvement of the community in that process. And they must be felt or made to feel and made to realize that they're in fact part of that process. So I'll move away from what seems to be a draconian term like enforcement and go to a more proactive term like protection. But that for me is how I see that community involvement. And of course, in all of that complexity is how does the state then treat the finding of archaeological artifacts? Does it belong to the landowner on whose land it was found? Is there any share of that to be given to the person who found it? And of course, what is the ultimate responsibility of the state? And I think that these perhaps are questions that we can ask. In our jurisdictions, there's almost a kind of a shared understanding. Landowner, the person who finds it, and the Crown then becomes the final arbiter as it relates to how the item is to be valued, how those people are to be recompensed for what they found, and then I use the Crown, the state, how the state then interprets that for the wider community. But you're quite correct, it is complex, but it is also necessary for, I believe, especially when we look at an island like Barbados, where every time you go and perhaps dig more than a foot down to plant something, you're going to come across something of interest. And we just need to understand where those things are, how they speak to the wider story, how the community's involvement helps in the preservation, and how is that then interfaced with the wider government system in ensuring preservation, conservation, and interpretation for the wider community.
Before you shut off, I mean, thank you very much for your answer. But let me give you a very practical, response. I live in an area of Barbados. It's called Silver Hill. It's a fairly large area, and one of my ancestors, man who became known later as John Thomas Brewster, was formerly enslaved on a plantation, small plantation owned by a man called Thomas Ruck. In 1835, John Thomas Brewster we find him getting married, and his enslaver, the former enslaver, becomes a witness at his wedding. So we identify where he's located. By 1847, just a few years later, in 1847, and surprisingly for Barbados, he becomes one of the listed landowners in Christchurch, owning about 2 acres. Well, subsequent to that, that land was bequeathed to, part of that 2 acres, or half acre of that land, was bequeathed to my great grandmother through her grandmother, who was a daughter of John Thomas Brewster. And then later on, my father was deeded a piece about just about 12,000 square feet. And I received that land and finally made sure of the title, proper title for it and everything. While excavating on that land, I came across what I call a rubbish heap, where my ancestor and his family, because they had built a house on the land and called it Labour Cottage. Incidentally, I have a house on my property which I built Labour Cottage, as we might know. So to some extent, and I have his will, John Thomas Brewster's will. So I have inherited, as we say, some artifacts in that were his, that he broke. When his china broke, he put them all in one spot, in one location. I'm planning one of these years to try to put all these things together. Is Chinaware and all the other things he had. But what I'm getting at is that call me the community. For want of a better word, I'm the community. I have inherited a piece of land. I have inherited artifacts in that land, which were clearly the property of my ancestor from enslavement. But now you have this body called the state, which becomes involved in the matter. And really what I'm trying to get at is, if I'm the community, surely there has to be a vested interest for me as a community in what happens to that property. And more than that, I would argue that I have a legal right to what I've discovered because by right of descent, by right of inheritance, I have a legal right to it. So when you said earlier, with the question of enforcement, I sort of imagined in my mind a conflict where the state might want to step in to say to me, well, you found these things, but now we are going to tell you what you must do with it.
Okay, so first of all, stick a pin there. Hold on a second. Don't stop. I like where you've gone. So the technical term that archaeologists use for a rubbish heap is a midden. Middens become extremely important because they allow us to recover how people consumed things, what they consumed, perhaps when, what was consumed within the things that we found. So we can do an entire reconstruction of a foodway and a lifeways patterns from that midden. That's one. In our current law, what you've excavated belongs to you. Now, let's say that you've recovered all of that information, You shared it, let's say, with the museum. We helped you to interpret it. It belongs to you. Someone breaks into your house,
Mm.
steals all of that material.
Mm.
It's now stolen property. The recovery of that stolen property needs to be somewhere placed within a bit of legislation, because it isn't just any stolen property. It is archaeological material,
Mm.
which belongs to you as the landowner, but which the law at present doesn't really identify as archaeology. So that when we talk about enforcement and recovery, it is about having a piece of legislation that allows us to identify that when we find a person who has taken that from you, we can say to them, well, listen, you didn't just find it somewhere. We know for a fact that Professor Welch excavated at Labour Court, and this is what he's found. Because in the process of your excavation, you corresponded with the requisite body who identified, or this is what you found, helped you to interpret what's there. So you have a record of what belongs to you. We have a record of what belongs to you, just in case something is stolen. And that for me is the important part. But the legislation underpins all of this. And I noted earlier in the chat, someone asked about how these provisions then correspond to the rights and descendants of First Peoples, and they should. And they would once you have the legislation. But if you don't have the legislation, then there's really nothing to say how you could in fact seek to identify these items of a particular community. So that for me is why legislation is important. And the other bit now about, let's call it protection, about you, the community. So if you, the community, understands that what you excavate on your land belongs to you, but that it has an intrinsic value for the entirety of the community, then I'm hoping that when people do what you've done, won't necessarily take what is a trash heap, to throw it on another trash heap for it to be discarded, but recognize the importance and value. And in recognizing the importance and value, contacts a museum or whomever to understand better what this story is. And I think that is critically important. And we need to get to that step. We're slowly getting there, but I think we need to get there a little faster, because, and I mean really, the rapid pace of development in the last 20 years is almost triple what it had been the previous 20. And as we begin to grow our housing stock in what traditionally would have been agricultural land, there is the potential as we go and place houses in old fields that we might come across another enslaved burial ground or another enslaved village. But because there's no legislation, there's nothing stopping the developer from bulldozing it, and we never know. And there goes a piece of our history that we will never be able to recover, simply because we did not have the legislation in place to say, stop, take a beat, let's find out what's happening. Not that archaeology is in conflict with development. It is not. They both can go hand in hand. They both can learn in a way from each other. Because if the development didn't happen, we would never know it was there. But at the same time, the development needs to have a pause in order for us to recover, so that we can better understand and explain our past. So I hope that kind of answers the question, but
Well
it is a
said.
complex one.
Well put.
Thank
Well
you.
put. Well
Thank
said.
you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Welch.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Welch. Kevin, there are two other questions. I don't know if you can see them. One is from Matt Riley and the other one is from Andrew Richards. Can you see them or you want me to read them?
Please read them. I can't, I'm not saying them.
Okay. The question from Matt: do you think there are specific research topics that are underexplored archaeology? That's the question. And then he ends with the second question, perhaps topics that might encourage more public engagement.
The answer there, Matt, is yes, yes, and yes. There are tons of underexplored. And for me, I'll go to what Professor Welch was talking about. We still don't know enough about how our tenantry systems were developed, or even what is the manner in which our free villages were developed. We understand in documentation, it happened there. But as you know, the archaeology will allow us a better understanding of what was consumed, what was discarded, how people lived, what they bought, what they purchased, what they ate. That is one. And the other one, and then I might preface what Andrew is going to ask, simply because I've done work with Andrew recently, looking at how climate change impacts archaeological sites. And the preliminary work done shows not only that it does, but it's doing so at a rapid rate. And we need to find a way to redress that imbalance. We still don't know enough about what people ate. We think we know, but no one has taken up a bowl or a pipe to do examinations about, well, what's being eaten. In terms of pipes, to do genetic work to see who are the people who are smoking. And these, I think, are research topics that can quickly grab the attention of the public. And when we speak to a space like Newton, we've got lots of pipe stems. Wouldn't it be utterly fascinating to do research on the pipe stems to see if we can identify who was smoking, and then turn around and go into the community to get samples to see, can we find the living relatives of those people? Because documentary evidence can sometimes take us only so far, and there tends to be a lot of roadblocks. So what Professor Welch has done is amazing. It doesn't happen very often. But archaeology potentially allows us the tools to make that particular connection a little faster in one way and a little wider in the other. And I hope that answers the question. But it also helps us to recover lost communities. Because again, and for people who don't know, Matt is the author of Below Cliff. The work done at Below Cliff allowed the recovery of a community that a lot of people have forgotten. It gone back into memory. And there are lots of villages in Barbados like that are simply a memory. I think it's important for us to go and recover them, recover the memories of the people, and where possible, find the genetic links that will link the present community to their past ancestors. But that also means that we need to have a really robust education around DNA and genetics and what we can learn from the DNA research into enslavement, or even beyond, back to first people, similar to what was done with Leiden University in a small community in Puerto Rico. So I hope that answers Matt's question.
Evan, we have, sorry.
And then Andrea's question, I'm
Right.
not saying it.
Are you seeing it? How will it address the
Yeah.
matter? Right, okay.
Right. Unfortunately, it is only archaeologists who say there does not have to be conflict with development. Developers do not see this. But I think if we encourage town and country planning to play a bigger role, to bring the two together, we can make better progress. I do agree there is that necessity, especially in a small space like Barbados, and especially given the development that is coming. There's a need for that sit down and recognition that they both are mutually sorry, losing my train of thought, can in fact have a mutual benefit to each other. And I go back to Port St. Charles. Port St. Charles, when we did it, As I said, the developer had sat down and agreed that we would go about doing this excavation whilst they did this development. That work was done by Dr. Druitt, and I forgot the other person very early on, brokered by Alessandra Cummins at the museum. During the first phase in 1995, the manager of the project bought prospective landowners down, showed them the work we were doing, indicated the manner in which they were going about their development to ensure the preservation of the past. By the end of that summer, that entire project was sold without a block being laid. I can only argue that part of it was on where it was going to be because the Haywards was picturesque, but the other was the care that the developer showed in what they were doing to safeguard the archaeological past. And for the first decade, when that site opened, the museum used to be invited down to talk to the landowners about what was discovered there because they had that particular interest. And for me, that yet again is a wonderful example of where archaeology and development can go hand in hand and not be seen as a place of contestation. So Andrea, I hope that answers your question. And I see that Lieutenant.
There's one other question that Andrea has before we go to Lieutenant. This question is how will it address the matter of resources? Sorry, the museum has done a lot of work in recent years, and this is commendable. How will it address the matter of resources to do the work moving forward, and also to address needed archaeological research that should be done? In the Caribbean, we depend a lot on universities from abroad to do this research. How might Barbados advance and take the reins in this area?
That's almost a dream question. It needs to come with 2 or 3 wonderful dream benefactors. For me, let's start with the legislation. If tomorrow government decides to enact, let me not call it antiquities legislation, cultural resource management legislation that dictates that a percentage of the developer's development fee goes towards archaeological research and CRM, as happens in both the UK, USA, and Canada. It means that we don't have to wait on external universities to drive the research. The research, in a way, is being driven internally and paid for locally. It means that we can have a thriving cultural resource management industry that involves anywhere the disciplines of archaeology, conservation, history, geographic information systems, as well as the sciences that looks at both DNA, as well as material culture coming to bear, paid for by commercial activity to ensure the better education of the public, because you have provided for and allowed for archaeological and its attendant research to be conducted before the potential destruction of site. So legislation provides the funds to fuel research, which can then in turn be done by local individuals. And of course, some of that pool of money is set aside for capacity building. Because the issue with relying on outside universities is that they might have a particular research paradigm, which they're going to get funded for 5 years. And a lot of that research is going to not necessarily enable local capacity because it's being aimed at their students wherever they are. But if we had CRM enacted, and this is where I'll use that word again, and enforced, we then have the funds by which to drive research and industry. And I hope that answers Andrea's question.
Kevin, thank you. Before I go to the lieutenant, I just want to add something to what you said in response to the question from Andrea and the number of external universities that come to Barbados. I think Barbados is one of the few CARICOM states that has enshrined in its physical development plan significant body of work related to cultural heritage. And my thinking is that the museum, through the Ministry of Culture, needs to put this on the table with the culture minister, who happens to be the prime minister, whereby in the areas within the physical development plan, which are shown as archaeological areas, that whenever there is development, a minimum of 1% of the development costs should be placed in a fund at the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill, and very specifically in the History and Archaeological Department, to advance the practice of archaeology and also to deepen and broaden our history. Lieutenant Adamson?
Thank you for that.
Good afternoon, all. Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can.
Right. Okay. I just had to check because I realized earlier I didn't see the icon for the mic. Anyways, good afternoon to all again.
Afternoon.
My question. I know that the lecture was more set along the lines of archaeology, and normally when we think about archaeology, we go back thousands, millions of years, etc., etc., etc. But I want to say in the outset that I support the endeavors of this group, but further along, why are we not being as aggressive as the developers that we are witnessing around these days? Good. Is it that we need a new body with a new name, a new mandate, a more robust organization? Are we stuck with the what persons like to call the staples in terms of the Barbados the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, the Barbados National Trust, etc.? And I ask these questions against the backdrop of the fact, and you know of my neck of the woods, Mr. Farmer and some others here. We had only 2 years ago, I believe, an 18th to 19th century cistern at Fort George Heights, which was, I believe, stumbled upon. Good. And initially there was a halt to the destruction of that cistern, but within a couple of days after, it was totally demolished. Now we look at the fact that more of the settlements tend to have been on the coastal areas. But I know, based on the records, that Fort George was selected as one of the inland, if you want to call it, garrisons that had existed back in the day. It was supposed to more or less take over from St. Anne's Fort at one point in time, but I think they mentioned that due to lack of funds, they were unable to move St. Anne's Fort or the men from St. Anne's Fort or use it as an alternative site. But generally, based on my knowledge and my experience, most of these developments in the outside the period which some persons will look at things being more or less archaeological, the fact remains that several of these ideas were borrowed from pre-existence, should I say, persons who had pre-existed in the particular areas. And I think that the destruction of that cistern, especially as it relates to me, if I were to go there and start to dig, what else could rather have been unearthed in that particular area, which might have spoken to, let's say, inland lookout, inland settlements, for, as you mentioned, the prehistoric persons and so on. Within the context, and I'm going to wrap up within less than 30 seconds, we now shift to the development that's going to exist or that will happen along, let's say, Bay Street, in the Bay Street and the Pierhead area. And I know, in terms of our more recent history, that there are several stories to be had from those areas. I was impressed to hear you mention that there was I lose the word. You said that Mr. Farmer, that there was a look and see or something like that. Correct me if I'm wrong. Pardon me?
I don't remember now. Look and see in relation to.
I think
No,
you're usually watching brief, Kevin.
Watch and brief.
Yes, they watch and brief.
Yes.
Right, good, sweet. So that more or less gives me a bit of comfort in that regard, and I hope that we can adopt that type of relationship going forward. We look at the fact also that we have moved beyond 10 years for Bridgetown, its historic garrison, as a UNESCO World Heritage Inscription site and so on. But how have we been able to monetize that this inscription and this prized possession, as some persons would say? Have we done enough? Are we doing enough? And finally, we have a situation where, and I have noted this over time, you have billboards when the developments come into play. You have billboards and you have the names of the architects, you have the names of the sponsors in terms of the funding, you have a whole host of people, but we do not see, for instance, the heritage firm or consultancy or department listed on that on that billboard, which has some sort of oversight to ensure that the building, the construction, etc., falls within the heritage parameters for which the area might be known, etc. And on that note, I am pleased to see that that building, which went up just around the corner from the Barbados Museum going into King's Village, fell right within the architecture of the area. And can we have more of that going around into the future? I'm obliged to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Lieutenant Adamson. All right, you said quite a bit. I jotted down some notes. I'm going to start at the first thing, legislation. So when you spoke about the need to deal with how some things are being demolished, and the thing about billboards and heritage firms, legislation. Without legislation, nothing is possible, because anytime you go to a town hall meeting, the developer will always tell you when these questions are asked that they are following the legislation. What I will say to you, which is right, because everything is by law. I said at the outset that culture resource management must be tied to legislation. In respect to Barbados, the legislation that we hang our hat on it was a Town Country Planning Development Act. It is now the Town Planning Development Act and the new fiscal development plan as policy.
Yeah.
That is where we hang our hat. So when developments proposals are sent to the museum and other institutions like us, we respond and we write what is our technical brief. What has happened over time is that the Town Planning Department takes note of what we've written. They write that then to the developer. stating that we've asked for a watching brief in certain areas, or that National Trust has asked for the architect to relook the architectural language to ensure that the building is in keeping with the district in which it's being placed. In most instances, the developers will follow that advice. But for me, that is only one piece of legislation. There's no legislation once construction begins that speaks to the safeguarding of the archaeological resource or how that is to be funded. Because to get back to your first question about the robustness of the organization is only as robust as the legislation allows it to. And there's very little legislation, there's very little robustness that can happen from these institutions. And the two institutions that you mentioned, the museum and the trust, are non-governmental organizations, even though both are enacted by acts of parliament. That is more or less the case in almost the entire Eastern Caribbean. We've been operating with cultural resource management hinged upon town planning acts and also, I dare say, upon the sensitivity of the town planner in relation to the environment, in recognizing that historical preservation goes hand in hand with planning development. If tomorrow you had an entire planning department that cared nothing about that, the hat that we hang whatever on will simply not allow us even a little bit of robustness because it simply isn't there. So there needs to be ever enabling legislation as it relates to archaeological resources, both terrestrial and marine, as it relates to the built environment, that allows for not only robustness, but a bit more teeth in how we go about the conservation and the preservation and the interpretation. And the reason why I said earlier about CRM, and Mark was kind enough to point out the 1% development costs, that 1% development cost is really what needs to be enforced in order for there then to be a thriving, I hate to use the word, let's call it research industry, around which commercial development pays for that type of what might be seen as academic research, which allows for greater education of our population. Now, specifically to Fort George Heights, what I will say to you in that instance, meetings were held. Unfortunately, what was being proposed at the time could go nowhere else because the majority of water supplied on this island is supplied by gravity. There was no ever high contour line on that ridge line for a reservoir to go except where it went. But what was done was there was a project, as I understand it, where a three-dimensional survey was done of that underground cistern. I will have to check and see where the 3D render is, but it exists. So again, part of the work of CRM is that you can't always save a site, but you can record it. And once recorded, the unfortunate element of demolition might take place. But without the legislation and without those discussions, then what occurred there would not have happened. And what might have taken place is what might take place in a lot of other places on island where archaeological resources are stumbled upon during the course of development, and they're silently destroyed. We were able, because of the news, both at Fort St. George and the enslaved burial ground at Fontebelle, it is where the Fourth Estate then played a role in bringing to the public's attention the possibility of, and then there was intervention. But the intervention still hung on a very small nail. And that very small nail is the Town Planning Act. And that's the only nail we've got to hang our hat on. There needs to be more nails. And I hope that answers the question, but also I think what you've done is allowed us to have a bigger discussion around the need for enabling legislation, which allows for a more systematic approach to how we go about preserving and conserving our archaeological and built heritage resources. And recognizing that we can't save everything, but we at least need to know what it was and record it so that we can learn from it. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I also want
And I
to extend thanks to all the participants and especially those persons who pose questions as we come to the end of this very, very thought-provoking session. I implore you to, and this you know being you, Kevin, and Alessandra in her capacity as director, to have that conversation with the ministry, with the Ministry of Culture, because when we look at the development that is supposed to take place from the garrison to Brighton, what is referred to, the planners are referring to as the bookends, there's going to be significant excavations within the Carlisle Bay area. And I think that this will give us the opportunity to benefit even as great as or even more from what transpired at Port St. Charles. But maybe that aspect of it may be a part of the lecture series next year. I would like to invite the audience to return next week for the next lecture, which is going to be delivered by Professor Pedro Welch. And the topic is Documenting Our National History, the Journal of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. And importantly, Professor Welch is the editor of that journal. So I can only imagine the richness of the information that the Professor Welch will share with us next week. So you're all invited to attend that lecture next week. And my final word is again to thank Kevin and the Barbados Museum for taking this very, very, very giant leap in continuing to educate Barbadians about our history. I attended the meeting last week. I was so happy when I saw the development proposal for the enslaved burial ground at Newton. And I think we are well on the way. Fortunately, you have a minister who is very much into culture. And you may recall that her first ministry in government was the Ministry of Culture. So yes, please blaze that trail while it is available.
We'll do. Thank you for that advice, Mark. We will take not other advisement, but we will take it and run with it.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you. And
All right,
I use this opportunity to say good evening to everyone. It was a pleasure being in your company, and we are all leaving richer in knowledge thanks to the presentation from Kevin. Thank you.
No, thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.